Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for the segment, we have Mark Marex, Director of Index Research and Development with Nasdaq Investment Intelligence, to discuss year-to-date performance in the Nasdaq Next Gen 100. Mark, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Trade Talks. We hear about the Nasdaq 100 all the time. Tell us what the composition of the Next Gen 100 is.
Sure, Jill. This index shares a lot of similarities with the Nasdaq 100. Obviously, the first and foremost being it's Nasdaq listed companies only. So whereas the Nasdaq 100 gives you pretty much the 100 largest non-financial companies listed on the Nasdaq exchange, this index, the Next Gen, targets the next 100 largest. So you'll see that the market cap size profiles of these companies tends to be quite a bit smaller. It's kind of on the lower edge of large cap and on the upper edge of the traditional mid cap bucketing. So what you can see here is, even though what we're showing is the top 20 names, they only make up about 33% of the index. There's a single security cap of 4% here, but that cap is rarely, if ever, even approached. Companies tend to max out at around 2, maybe 2.5, 3%. A max weight sometimes on their way to graduating out of this index and into the Nasdaq 100. So way less concentration at the upper end here than you'd see in the Nasdaq 100.
Kind of exciting. You can find your next bang in that index there. Tell us about recent drivers and performance.
Yeah, so it's funny that you mention the word FANG, because there's actually a company in this index you'll see in the performers on the right-hand side. I've got the top 20 listed there year to date versus prior year, kind of around the 8th or 9th largest one here. There's a ticker called FANG. No relation to Nasdaq 100 FANG. This is the ticker for a company called Diamondback Energy. And you'll see that its return for 2022 year to date is positive. That gray bar is above zero, up 17% year to date. It is one of only 2 companies in the top 20 that's positive year to date. Versus, look at last year, mirror image. You had all but 2 companies in this index of the current top 20 were positive in 2021, and a lot of them had really strong performances. So that kind of in a nutshell tells you the difference of what's happening in this index. Like the Nasdaq 100, there is a sizable exposure to tech as a sector, but not nearly as big. It's around 30 to 35% tech, as opposed to 50 to 60% tech in the Nasdaq 100. So even though it's not as strongly exposed to tech, it's still kind of overweight innovation, overweight growth, and some of those other sectors are getting hit just as hard, if not harder, than tech, given this pullback this year. On the left there, you can see what this index has done versus the NDX, the Nasdaq 100. It's underperformed that a little bit. It's very close in line with the Russell Midcap Growth there in yellow. And you can see the other indexes here from the S&P, regular midcap and midcap growth have also had pretty challenging year-to-date performances, few places to hide outside of energy year-to-date.
And what about market cap and where these companies are located, or when we look at the globality?
Yeah, so this, I think, is one of the cooler selling points of this index. Again, because it doesn't restrict like other mid-cap indexes in the US based on where the company is actually headquartered and domiciled. You could be domiciled anywhere as long as you're listed on the Nasdaq exchange. So you've got a pretty sizable chunk of international exposure here for folks who, maybe think that the US got a bit overvalued versus the rest of the world in the last decade or so, but still want that mid-cap exposure. This is a nice way to get a bit of international diversification. And then, as I mentioned, even though we do have some larger companies here that would maybe be considered at the lower end of a large cap classification, it's mostly mid-cap. Very close in terms of average, median, weighted average market caps to that Russell Midcap Growth, but quite a bit larger than that overall mid-cap benchmark from the S&P, looking at, not just growth names, but value names in there as well.
And your last chart here, let's take a look at Nasdaq Next Gen 100 and the R&D spend and investment that they have for future growth.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways I could talk to you about why this is an innovation leader within the mid-cap space. I think this is the clearest, the easiest way for folks to see it. Index was launched in 2020. We have a back test going back to 2010. You can see every year since then, the blue bar has been really quite substantially above the rest, but especially above that broadest mid-cap benchmark, the S&P Midcap 400, on average anywhere from 3 to 4 times the proportion of total revenue, total sales in the companies in this index gets reinvested back into R&D. The last couple of years, it's averaged around 5.5%, 6%, 7% of total revenue reinvested back into R&D. That's a constant innovation driver in things like patents and other intangibles, and really has propelled this index over a long time horizon to strongly outperform not just things like the Midcap 400, but also the Russell Midcap Growth, which in theory, is a very, very close competitor in terms of the type of exposure, but still in terms of performance, in terms of innovation, this index kind of consistently wins out on that battle. So some challenging performance recently, not completely surprised, again, given the exposure to very high growth, the fact that factor is getting challenged out in the market as rates go up, and we kind of continue having this uncertain outlook with inflation. But the long-term horizon, I think, is still very positive for this index, and folks should pay attention to how much valuations have come down in the last year. It's starting to get, very, very attractive from that perspective.
All right, Mark, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.